I was a barista betrayed by coworkers until I exposed their credit card skimming scheme. But that morning, standing in Marcus's office with termination papers sliding across his desk, I had no idea the betrayal ran deeper than I could imagine. The papers landed with a whisper. 2 weeks of severance, effective immediately. Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes as his fingers drummed against the mahogany desk, the same rhythm he used when lying to customers about our organic certification. I'd worked the morning shift at Grind Coffee for 3 years. Same corner, same regulars, same perfectly calibrated espresso shots that kept the downtown professionals functioning. But this morning felt different the moment I walked through the back door. Silence where there should have been chatter. Averted glances from Riley and Devin, my supposed friends who'd shared countless shifts, covering each other's mistakes and splitting tips. The accusation was theft. $500 missing from the register over the past month. The evidence, Marcus explained while his eyes focused somewhere over my shoulder, pointed directly to me. Timestamps, register access codes, even security footage that allegedly showed me pocketing cash during busy morning rushes. My stomach clenched as the pieces fell into place. The way Riley had been handling more transactions lately, always jumping to help during peak hours. Devin's sudden interest in working opening shifts, arriving early to prep the machines. Their whispered conversations that stopped whenever I approached. I signed the papers without argument. Let Marcus assume my silence meant guilt. Let Riley and Devin exchange those knowing glances as I cleaned out my locker, stuffing my apron and personal coffee tumbler into a paper bag that crinkled too loudly in the oppressive quiet. But as I walked toward the exit, something caught my eye. Devin was handling a customer's credit card at the register, and his movement seemed wrong. Too practiced. His thumb covering the card reader as he swiped. A motion so quick and smooth it could have been natural. Could have been. The customer never looked down. Never noticed Devin's phone positioned at a precise angle near the register. Never saw the tiny device barely visible beneath Devin's thumb as the card slid through what I now realized wasn't just a standard reader. 3 years of trust. 3 years of considering them friends. 3 years of covering their shifts when they called in sick. Of sharing my grandmother's secret to perfect foam art. Of believing their concern when they asked about my financial struggles after my father's medical bills started piling up. They hadn't just framed me. They'd been running a skimming operation right under everyone's noses, using my desperation as the perfect cover story when things got too hot. I pushed through the front door and felt the morning air hit my face like a slap. The downtown rush continued around me, oblivious. Suits clutching coffee cups, construction workers grabbing breakfast sandwiches, students with laptops and dreams, all of them potential victims of the scheme I just uncovered. My phone buzzed. A text from Riley timed perfectly as I reached the sidewalk. Sorry it went down like this. Maybe you can find something in retail. The casual cruelty of it made my hands shake. But beneath the anger, something cold and calculating began to take shape. They thought they'd won. Thought they'd successfully transferred their crimes onto the naive barista who never questioned why they'd become so interested in handling transactions. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. I walked 6 blocks to my apartment, climbed 3 flights of stairs, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a notepad beside it. The termination papers lay spread across the surface like evidence in a crime scene, which I was beginning to understand they essentially were. First, I needed to understand exactly what I'd witnessed. Credit card skimming wasn't some sophisticated operation requiring technical genius. It was simple, methodical, and devastatingly effective when done right. A device attached to or replacing the card reader. A camera positioned to capture PIN entries. Sometimes just a quick photo of the card with a phone camera positioned correctly. Devin's movement replayed in my mind. The way his thumb had covered the reader, the positioning of his phone, the practiced smoothness that spoke of repetition, routine, confidence. How long had this been going on? How many customers had been compromised? How many people would discover fraudulent charges on their statements in the coming days and weeks, never connecting them to their morning coffee run? My laptop screen glowed as I researched everything I could find about credit card fraud, skimming operations, and the legal consequences. Federal charges, years in prison, massive fines. The kind of life-destroying consequences that made a wrongful termination look like a gentle slap. But I needed proof. Real evidence, not just suspicions and a glimpse of suspicious behavior. Marcus had been thorough in framing me. Security footage, timestamps, documentation. If I was going to turn the tables, I needed to be even more thorough. I started with their social media. Riley's Instagram showed a sudden uptick in expensive purchases over the past 2 months. Designer clothes, high-end electronics, weekend trips to wine country, all documented with careful precision by someone who clearly didn't understand that flaunting wealth was the fastest way to attract attention during a fraud investigation. Devin was more careful online, but not careful enough. His Twitter complained about minimum wage, while his location tags showed him at restaurants that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. A simple cross-reference with his work schedule showed these expensive dinners happening right after busy shifts. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in solution. Busy shifts meant more customers, more transactions, more opportunities. Higher-end neighborhoods during morning rushes meant customers with larger credit limits and less attention to small charges. They'd been methodical, strategic, and completely convinced of their own cleverness. My phone rang. Marcus. I let it go to voicemail, then listened with growing interest as his voice filled my kitchen. The message was brief but revealing. Something about needing to discuss my final paycheck, about paperwork that needed to be completed. But underneath the professional tone, I detected something else. Nervousness, urgency, the kind of stress that came from knowing you'd made a mistake and weren't sure how big that mistake might become. Marcus was involved. Of course he was. The perfect setup required management participation. Someone had to doctor the security footage, manipulate the timestamps, and provide cover when customers inevitably started calling about fraudulent charges. I called in sick to my backup retail job, the one I'd been planning to rely on until I found something better. This was more important than pushing hangers around a department store. This was about justice, about turning the tables so completely that they'd never see it coming. The next morning, I positioned myself across the street from Grind Coffee with a borrowed telephoto lens and a clear view of the register. The morning rush provided perfect cover, dozens of people coming and going, creating natural distractions while I documented everything. Riley worked the register while Devin handled the espresso machine. Their choreography was flawless, practiced, elegant in its simplicity. Riley would position customers so Devin could capture card information with his phone when they handed over payment. Quick photos of the front and back, sometimes a short video that would reveal the CVV code and expiration date. The skimming device was invisible to casual observation, integrated so smoothly into the existing reader that even I had trouble spotting it from across the street. But the behavior patterns were unmistakable once you knew what to look for. The slight pause as cards were swiped, the careful positioning of hands and phones, the way they exchanged glances after particularly successful captures. I documented everything. Timestamps, customer descriptions, the specific movements that revealed their technique. 3 hours of surveillance produced a detailed record of their operation, complete with clear photos of the phone positioning and suspicious behavior around the card reader. But I needed more than documentation. I needed to understand their full network, their methods for converting stolen information into actual money, and most importantly, I needed evidence that would hold up in court. That afternoon, I called my cousin Jake, who worked in cybersecurity for a mid-sized tech company. Our conversation was careful, hypothetical, focused on educational curiosity about how these operations typically function. Credit card information got sold on dark web marketplaces, usually in batches organized by credit limits and geographic location. The actual fraudulent charges often happen weeks or months later, making it difficult to trace back to the original point of compromise. But the skimming devices themselves left digital fingerprints, and the phones used to capture images contained evidence that could destroy everyone involved. Jake's casual mention of law enforcement resources available for fraud investigations gave me an idea. A dangerous idea, but one that could provide the evidence I needed while simultaneously protecting future victims. I spent the evening crafting an anonymous tip to the financial crimes unit of the local police department. Not enough information to trigger an immediate investigation, but enough to establish a paper trail and encourage them to start paying attention to patterns of fraud connected to businesses in the downtown area. The tip included specific details about timing, morning rushes, particular days of the week when skimming activity seemed highest based on my observations. I mentioned the possibility of employee involvement and suggested they might want to review security footage from businesses where clusters of fraud originated. Then I waited. 3 days passed. I continued my surveillance, building a more complete picture of their operation while documenting every suspicious transaction. Riley and Devin had settled into a routine that spoke of confidence and complacency. They thought they'd solved their biggest problem by eliminating me, not realizing they'd created a much bigger one. On Thursday morning, my patience was rewarded. Two customers from Tuesday's documented transactions called the coffee shop within an hour of each other. I couldn't hear the conversations from across the street, but Marcus's body language told the story. Stiff posture, rapid gestures, glances toward the register that lingered too long. Riley and Devin noticed his stress. Their own movements became less fluid, more cautious. The easy confidence of Monday and Tuesday gave way to nervous energy and frequent glances toward the back office where Marcus spent increasing amounts of time on the phone. By Friday, they'd made their first major mistake. Devin arrived 30 minutes early for his shift and spent time alone with the register before the shop opened. I watched through the telephoto lens as he worked to remove the skimming device, tucking it into his apron pocket with movements sharp with panic. But he'd forgotten about the security cameras, the same ones that had allegedly captured my supposed theft. The same cameras that were now recording him tampering with the register in ways that would be impossible to explain away. They were unraveling and they didn't even know it. My phone buzzed with a text from Riley. "Hey, want to grab drinks tonight?" Feel bad about how things went down. The audacity was breathtaking. They'd stolen my job, destroyed my reputation, and put dozens of innocent customers at financial risk, and now they wanted to buy me a beer to smooth things over. I typed back a single word: sure. We met at Murphy's, a dive bar 6 blocks from the coffee shop where the lighting was dim and the music loud enough to cover conversation. Riley arrived first, already nursing a beer and wearing an expression of calculated remorse that didn't reach her eyes. She gestured to the empty chair across from her, and I sat down without ordering anything. Alcohol would dull the sharp edge I needed to maintain for what came next. Riley leaned forward, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry over the background noise. She talked about how sorry she was, how Marcus had pressured everyone to find a scapegoat when the missing money investigation started. She mentioned Devin's financial troubles, his sick mother, the pressure they'd all been under. None of it was true, of course, but it revealed something more valuable than truth. It revealed their strategy. They were preparing their defense, crafting a narrative that painted them as reluctant participants in Marcus's scheme. Small-time employees who'd been coerced into minor theft to save their jobs. It was almost elegant in its simplicity. Almost believable. It might even have worked if I hadn't spent the past week documenting the reality of their operation. Devin arrived 20 minutes later, sliding into the booth beside Riley with nervous energy that made his hands tremble slightly as he reached for his beer. His eyes swept the bar constantly, the hyper-vigilance of someone who knew he was in dangerous territory, but couldn't resist the urge to manage the situation. They took turns elaborating on their story. Marcus had been skimming for months, they claimed. Small amounts at first, then increasingly bold theft as he realized no one was watching closely enough to catch him. When corporate started asking questions, he needed someone to blame. I was the obvious choice, they explained with voices heavy with manufactured regret. The struggling employee with financial problems, the one who'd been asking for extra shifts and seemed desperate for money. It had been Marcus's idea to plant evidence, to manipulate the security footage, to create a paper trail that would satisfy corporate's investigation. They painted themselves as victims almost as tragic as me, caught between loyalty to a friend and fear of losing their own jobs, forced to stay silent while an innocent person took the blame for someone else's crimes. The performance was masterful. If I hadn't spent the past week watching them methodically commit fraud, I might have believed every word. Devin's phone lit up on the table between us, a notification from his banking app, probably updating him on another successful fraudulent transaction. He quickly flipped it face down, but not before I caught a glimpse of the balance notification. $4,000, in an account that should have been nearly empty given his supposed financial struggles. I excused myself to the restroom and spent 5 minutes in the cramped space, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. They thought they were managing me, controlling the narrative, ensuring my silence with a combination of false sympathy and implied threats. They had no idea that every word they'd spoken was another piece of evidence in the case I was building against them. When I returned to the table, Riley was checking her own phone. Devin was fidgeting with a cocktail napkin, tearing it into precise strips while his eyes continued their constant surveillance of the bar. They were scared, trying to project control and confidence, but fundamentally terrified that their carefully constructed scheme was beginning to collapse around them. I let them buy me another round of drinks I didn't touch, listened to more elaborate justifications and false apologies, and allowed them to believe they were successfully manipulating me into silence. By the time we parted ways in the parking lot, they were convinced they'd neutralized the threat I represented. Riley's goodbye included a casual mention of how much trouble false accusations could cause for everyone involved. Devin's handshake lingered just long enough to feel like a warning. They drove away believing they'd won. Believing their secret was safe, their operation could continue, and their former friend had been successfully intimidated into keeping quiet about what she might have observed. They were wrong about everything. Saturday morning, I returned to my surveillance position with renewed focus. The conversation at Murphy's had revealed critical details about their operation's structure and timeline. More importantly, it had shown me exactly how they planned to defend themselves when everything inevitably collapsed. Marcus arrived at the coffee shop early, spending nearly an hour in his office before unlocking the front door. His movements were sharp, efficient, focused. He was preparing for something, and I suspected I knew what. Riley and Devin arrived within minutes of each other, their casual morning greetings masking the tension that radiated from their every gesture. The easy confidence of the previous week had been replaced by hyper-vigilant professionalism. They were shutting down the operation. Over the next 2 hours, I watched them methodically eliminate evidence. Devin spent considerable time around the register during slow periods, his hands working beneath the counter in ways that suggested he was removing hardware. Riley made multiple trips to the back office, carrying what looked like documents and electronic devices. Marcus supervised with barely contained anxiety, his attention split between the cleanup operation and the steady stream of customers who remained oblivious to the criminal enterprise being dismantled around them. By noon, they transformed back into innocent coffee shop employees. No skimming devices, no suspicious phone positioning, no obvious evidence of the fraud scheme that had been operating under everyone's noses for months. But they'd made one critical error in their cleanup operation. They'd assumed the evidence existed only in physical form: devices, documents, phones. They'd forgotten about the digital trail that extended far beyond their immediate control. Bank records, spending patterns, security footage from other businesses, the financial crime unit's investigation that my anonymous tip had already set in motion. Most importantly, they'd underestimated the thoroughness of my own documentation. That afternoon, I compiled everything: photos, videos, detailed notes, timeline analysis, financial records pulled from social media, transcripts of our conversation at Murphy's. The complete picture of their operation, from setup through execution to attempted cover-up. The evidence package was comprehensive, professional, and devastating. It read like a federal prosecutor's dream case, complete with clear motives, documented methods, and a trail of victims that would generate significant media attention once the arrest started. But I wasn't ready to turn it over yet. I wanted to watch them think they'd escaped. Wanted them to believe their cleanup had been successful, their tracks covered, their future secured. I wanted them to feel safe right up until the moment their world collapsed completely. Monday morning, I applied for unemployment benefits using the wrongful termination paperwork Marcus had provided. The process was straightforward, bureaucratic, routine. Just another struggling worker trying to navigate the system after losing a job. But the paperwork created an official record of my firing, complete with stated reasons and timeline. When investigators eventually compared these documents to the evidence of ongoing fraud, the setup would become obvious to anyone with basic analytical skills. Marcus had been thorough in framing me, but his thoroughness would ultimately destroy him. Every piece of fabricated evidence was now part of a federal case file, and every inconsistency would raise questions he couldn't answer. Tuesday, I received my final paycheck. The amount was exactly what I'd expected, down to the penny. Marcus had been scrupulously careful to avoid any appearance of impropriety in our final financial transaction. The irony was beautiful. He'd stolen thousands of dollars from customers through an elaborate fraud scheme, but he made sure to pay me every cent I was owed to avoid any potential legal complications. I deposited the check and used part of the money to purchase a prepaid phone. Untraceable communication would be essential for the next phase of my plan. Wednesday morning, I made my first anonymous call to the Financial Crimes Unit. The conversation was brief, focused, professional. I provided specific dates, times, and transaction details that would allow investigators to cross-reference their records with security footage and identify patterns of fraudulent activity. The detective who took my call was experienced, thorough, skeptical in exactly the ways that made him good at his job. He asked probing questions designed to determine whether I was a credible source or someone with a personal grievance trying to cause trouble for former coworkers. I answered every question with calm precision, providing details that only someone with direct observation of the operation could know. By the end of the call, his tone had shifted from skeptical to intensely interested. An investigation was officially opening. Thursday, Riley posted Instagram photos from an expensive dinner at the kind of restaurant that required reservations weeks in advance. Devin tweeted complaints about overtime policies while checking in at a luxury spa. Marcus updated his LinkedIn profile with increased management responsibilities and professional development achievements. They were celebrating, convinced they'd successfully eliminated their biggest threat and covered their tracks completely, ready to resume their operation or transition to new opportunities with confidence that their criminal enterprise would remain buried. I screenshot everything: social media posts, location tags, spending displays. Every piece of evidence that would demonstrate their financial capabilities far exceeded their legitimate income sources. Friday morning brought the first sign that their confidence was misplaced. A police car parked outside Grind Coffee for 30 minutes during the morning rush. The officer inside appeared to be conducting routine surveillance, but his positioning provided clear sight lines to the register, and his presence created exactly the kind of nervous energy that made guilty people behave suspiciously. Riley and Devin noticed immediately. Their carefully practiced service routine became stilted, overly formal. Marcus emerged from his office repeatedly, finding reasons to check on front-of-house operations that had been running smoothly for months without his direct supervision. The officer left without making contact, but the message was clear. Law enforcement was paying attention. Someone had raised questions that required investigation. The safe, controlled environment they'd operated in was no longer guaranteed. That afternoon, Marcus called an impromptu staff meeting. I wasn't invited, obviously, but I didn't need to be. The meeting lasted 45 minutes, during which the coffee shop remained closed, despite being in the middle of the usual afternoon rush. When they reopened, their body language told the story. Tight shoulders, forced smiles, the kind of hyper-vigilant professionalism that screamed guilt to anyone who knew what to look for. They were preparing for scrutiny they thought they'd avoided. Saturday, I made my second anonymous call to the Financial Crimes Unit. This time, I provided specific information about the cleanup operation I'd witnessed, including details about devices being removed and documents being destroyed. The detective remembered our previous conversation. His questions were sharper now, more focused on actionable intelligence that could support search warrants and formal investigations. I described the timing of suspicious activities, the roles of individual employees, and the management structure that would have been necessary to support an ongoing fraud operation. I mentioned the wrongful termination of an employee who might have been eliminated because they'd become suspicious of irregularities. By Sunday, I had confirmation that multiple agencies were coordinating their response. Financial crimes, local police, federal banking regulators. The kind of multi-jurisdictional task force that formed when investigators discovered a criminal enterprise larger and more sophisticated than initially suspected. Monday morning, I positioned myself across the street with camera equipment and a clear view of all entrances to Grind Coffee. The morning rush proceeded normally for exactly 47 minutes. Then 3 unmarked cars arrived simultaneously. Federal agents in suits and local detectives in tactical gear entered through both the front door and the back service entrance. Customers were politely asked to leave while employees were instructed to remain for questioning. I watched through the telephoto lens as Riley, Devin, and Marcus were separated and led to different areas of the coffee shop. Their faces showed the progression from confusion to understanding to barely controlled panic as the reality of their situation became clear. The search was methodical, professional, devastating. Every register, every computer, every phone, every document. The agents knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it, guided by the detailed intelligence that had been building for weeks. Devin's phone was seized during the initial sweep. Riley's purse was searched, revealing devices that would require expert analysis to fully understand. Marcus's office was systematically dismantled, producing boxes of evidence that would take months to process completely. But the most beautiful moment came when they discovered the hastily concealed skimming equipment that Devin had thought he'd successfully hidden. The devices were still there, still functional, still containing digital evidence of thousands of illegal transactions. His panic-driven cleanup operation had been incomplete, leaving behind exactly the kind of physical proof that would make denial impossible. I watched as all 3 of them were placed in handcuffs and led to separate vehicles. Their carefully constructed story about Marcus being the sole perpetrator dissolved the moment investigators found evidence of coordinated activity involving all the employees. The wrongful termination paperwork that had seemed like such a clever way to eliminate a potential witness now looked like exactly what it was: an attempt to silence someone who'd gotten too close to discovering their operation. As the police cars pulled away, I felt a satisfaction so pure and complete, it was almost spiritual. They'd destroyed my reputation, stolen my job, and put countless innocent people at financial risk. But in the end, their own greed and arrogance had provided me with everything I needed to destroy them completely. The next morning, local news covered the arrest as a major financial fraud case. Federal charges, potential sentences measured in decades, victim impact statements that would generate national attention. The kind of life-destroying consequences that made a wrongful termination look like a gentle suggestion. Riley's Instagram account was flooded with comments from people who'd connected her expensive lifestyle to the fraud charges. Devin's Twitter was suspended after users discovered his complaints about minimum wage, while simultaneously documenting thousands of dollars in fraudulent spending. Marcus faced additional charges related to his management role and the attempted cover-up. His LinkedIn profile became a cautionary tale about how quickly a professional reputation could be destroyed by criminal prosecution. But the most satisfying moment came 3 days later, when I received a phone call from the Financial Crimes Unit. They wanted to discuss my potential testimony as a witness in the federal case. My wrongful termination, they explained, was now viewed as a crucial element in establishing the defendant's consciousness of guilt and their attempts to obstruct justice. The very action they'd taken to silence me had become the key piece of evidence that would ensure their convictions. I met with prosecutors the following week in a downtown office building with views of the city skyline. The case they'd built was comprehensive, damning, and utterly convincing. Financial records, digital evidence, victim testimony, surveillance footage, and my own detailed documentation of their operation. But they were particularly interested in my story. The employee who'd gotten too close to the truth, the wrongful termination that revealed their desperation, the weeks of careful observation that had provided law enforcement with the intelligence needed to build an airtight case. I was offered witness protection, relocated employment, even financial compensation for my cooperation in what had become a major federal investigation. All of it generous, professional, exactly what someone in my position should expect from grateful prosecutors. I declined everything except the opportunity to testify. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I took the stand on Tuesday of the second week, wearing a navy blue suit I'd purchased specifically for the occasion, and carrying a folder containing copies of every piece of evidence I'd gathered during my investigation. The courtroom was packed with victims, media, family members, and legal professionals who'd come to witness what had become a landmark case in financial fraud prosecution. Riley, Devin, and Marcus sat at the defendant's table in their own carefully chosen suits, flanked by defense attorneys who'd been working for months to construct some version of reality that might result in reduced sentences. Their strategy was predictable: blame Marcus for masterminding the scheme, while portraying Riley and Devin as reluctant participants who'd been coerced into minor involvement. Suggest that my termination had been based on legitimate concerns about employee theft, rather than retaliation for suspicious inquiries. Paint me as a disgruntled former employee with personal motivations for fabricating evidence against former coworkers. It might have worked if they hadn't left such a comprehensive trail of evidence. The prosecutor walked me through my testimony with methodical precision. My employment history, my observations of suspicious behavior, the wrongful termination that had eliminated a potential witness, and my subsequent investigation that had provided law enforcement with actionable intelligence. Each piece of evidence was presented with careful context and supporting documentation. Photos, videos, financial records, social media posts, transcripts of recorded conversations. The complete picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise and the attempted cover-up that had ultimately led to their discovery. Defense attorneys attacked my credibility with expected vigor. Personal financial problems, potential grudges against former coworkers, possible motivations for fabricating evidence to pursue wrongful termination lawsuits. But they couldn't explain away the digital evidence, couldn't justify the financial discrepancies, couldn't account for the sophisticated skimming operation that required coordination between multiple employees and management oversight. Most importantly, they couldn't explain why an innocent employer would fire someone for asking questions about register irregularities unless there was something to hide. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Riley, guilty on all counts. 15 years federal prison, complete financial restitution, permanent prohibition from employment and financial services. Devin, guilty on all counts. 12 years federal prison, joint financial liability, supervised probation for additional 5 years upon release. Marcus, guilty on all counts plus additional charges for obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. 22 years federal prison, forfeiture of all assets connected to the criminal enterprise, permanent prohibition from business management roles. I sat in the gallery watching their faces as the verdicts were read. The careful composure they'd maintained throughout the trial cracked completely, revealing the desperate panic they'd been hiding behind expensive suits and confident legal strategies. Riley cried. Devin stared at the floor. Marcus looked directly at me with an expression of pure hatred that made clear he understood exactly how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. They'd thought they were clever, thought they could eliminate a threat, cover their tracks, and continue their profitable operation without consequences. They'd underestimated the wrong person at exactly the wrong time. As the bailiffs led them away in handcuffs, I felt the same cold satisfaction I'd experienced during my weeks of careful investigation. Justice wasn't just served. It was served with precision, style, and a completeness that would echo for decades. Outside the courthouse, reporters wanted interviews. Victim advocacy groups wanted statements. Legal experts wanted analysis of how the case had developed from a simple wrongful termination into a major federal fraud prosecution. I declined everything. The story had been told completely in that courtroom, with evidence and testimony and legal consequences that spoke more clearly than any media interview could manage. 3 months later, I received a job offer from a financial consulting firm that specialized in fraud prevention. The salary was 3 times what I'd made as a barista, with benefits that included professional development funds and opportunities for advanced training in investigative techniques. My new colleagues treated me with the kind of respect reserved for someone who'd proven their capabilities under pressure. My case study was used in training materials, my investigation methods were incorporated into standard operating procedures, and my story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating seemingly powerless employees. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that Riley, Devin, and Marcus were spending their days in federal prison, understanding completely how their own arrogance and greed had created the perfect conditions for their downfall. They'd betrayed a barista. In return, I'd exposed their credit card skimming scheme and destroyed their lives with methodical precision. The score was settled. The account was balanced. Justice was served cold, exactly as it should be. And somewhere in a federal prison, they had plenty of time to think about why they should never have underestimated the quiet employee who noticed everything and forgot nothing. I never returned to grind coffee. The building now houses a yoga studio whose customers have no idea they're stretching and meditating in a space where a sophisticated criminal enterprise once operated. The register where thousands of credit cards were compromised has been replaced by a simple payment tablet that processes transactions with secure, regulated technology. Sometimes I drive past on my way to work, just to remind myself how completely the tables can turn when someone refuses to accept injustice quietly. They thought they'd won. They were wrong about everything.